Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's exciting conversation with Joseph Kenner, the CEO of Greyston up in Yonkers, New York. This is an important conversation because in many ways, it reflects the very best of what Concordia stands for. Because at its basic construct, Concordia is about helping to solve complex issues and achieve a higher purpose by bringing together a nonprofit community, private corporations, and government to advance noble outcomes. Today, we have one such person doing just that, advancing workforce outcomes for our most vulnerable individuals within a community that has a substantial need. Joseph Kenner, welcome to this webinar.
Hello, Gary. Thank you for having me.
Let me begin.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Joseph. I'm going to jump in here before we get too far into this conversation set. Now that we're fully live, my name is Hannah Delmet. I'm Senior Director of Partnerships here at Concordia, and it's our sincere pleasure to welcome Gary Officer and Joseph Kenner to today's conversation. So this conversation is held in partnership with Greyston Bakery, a Concordia patron member. Last summer, following the murder of George Floyd, Concordia made a series of commitments to contribute to our own organization's journey towards operating in an equitable and just manner. One such commitment was to elevate through its membership our organizations that are on the front lines of supporting racial and social justice here in the United States. So we quickly internally aligned on Greyston Bakery being one of those groups that we wanted to engage because of the phenomenal work that they're doing. This for-profit company has designed and championed an open hiring model that can be applied to a number of industries and employment opportunities. And Concordia is actively working to present this approach to companies, large and small, to better support economic mobility and job creation that benefits all members of society. And as here in the United States, we talk through things like unemployment, economic recovery, and economic mobility, it's a really pertinent model to be sharing with you today. So today's conversation between Greyston CEO Joseph Kenner and the Center for Workforce Inclusion's President and CEO Gary Officer, he's got one more affiliation, he's a Concordia advisor as well. This will get at what's really necessary for all American citizens, but especially those representing the marginalized Black community to achieve the American dream. Before we get to that all too critical and timely conversation, though, I have just the fun housekeeping remarks for today. Listeners are encouraged to use the Q&A feature of the Spot Me to Ask Questions. Gary is going to be pulling from this towards the end of the conversation, so bring your ideas, bring your questions, and make sure you put those into the chat. For any non-questions, more so pertinent points you're doing on this, we want to hear that as well. Concordia is constantly making introductions and facilitating conversations between our member community. So if you're doing something in this space that's pertinent and relevant to what Gary and Joe are just going to speak to, by all means, pop that into the discussion forum so that we can collect on it, share it with other stakeholders, and help make this model or other models of improved hiring and workforce inclusion more of the mainstream here in the US. You can take this conversation externally. You can tag at Concordia Summit or at Greyston Bakery and any of our speakers on social media. And this webinar, of course, will be recorded and available on our website, along with a summary of today's conversations. So if you know somebody who would love to hear from either of these great leaders on their work, you can just share that little link. Finally, if you have not yet done so, the Concordia Annual Summit is open for registration. All members are encouraged to register for either in-person or virtual attendance, and anybody new to Concordia can check out those virtual tickets and find a way to join this global conversation. With that, it's my sincere pleasure to turn everything back over to Gary. Gary, thanks so much for kicking us off with that tech snafu on my side, and you both have a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much indeed.
All right.
Thank you. Joseph, about a year ago, a dear colleague and friend of mine, Aaron David Miller, penned an article for the CWI Labs in which he tried to capture the mood of the times exactly a year ago in an article that he wrote for us. I want to share with you a quote from that article and to get your reaction to that. He said, "Looking at the events in the past several months, one is tempted to recall Dr. Martin Luther King's notion of the fierce urgency of now, a phrase intended to convey his impatience and frustration with the caution of the liberal establishment on what would soon become the historic 1964 Civil Rights Act. Indeed, rarely in American history has there seemed to be a moment filled with more urgency and promise of change. That urgency has been given even more intensity by a trifecta of crises affecting the nation, with eerie echoes of past events that have carried profound consequences for the nation. And it goes without saying that these crises have disproportionately brought grievous consequences to communities of color. We have the greatest threat to public health in a century not seen since the 1918-1920 Great Influenza, an economic recession with an unemployment levels not witnessed since the 1929 Great Depression, and massive social unrest last experienced during the 1960s. It's no wonder, he argues, that many have referred to this moment as an inflection point or social tipping point in our history. Would you indulge me in responding to that statement on how these events over the last 12 months have shaped you and have guided your leadership at Greystone?
Wow. There is a lot in that quote. What stands out for me is that phrase, the fierce urgency of now. It's just over a year now that I've been president and CEO of Greyston. And I was appointed at a time where we had COVID at its height. We had the George Floyd incident. We now have this severe economic challenge before us. And you look at the numbers, 9.2, 9.3 million jobs unfilled, 9.5 people looking for work, and then another 9.6, almost 10 million folks who have dropped out of the labor force because of barriers. How all of this is shaping me, and not just shaped, but shaping me, is this was the reason why Greyston, and I just want to correct the pronunciation, Greyston was founded back in 1982 to address some of these, unfortunately, same challenges that we're still dealing with today: inclusion, employment, the forgotten. This is why we were founded. The beauty, though, of Greyston is we were part of the solution, and we've always been. And our answer to these challenges is what we call open hiring, which opens the door of opportunity, of employment to those who have resolved that they want to work, they want to learn something new, they want to be personally successful, not just for themselves, but for their families. And we give them that opportunity each and every day. And it's just that, an opportunity, not a promise. This is a reciprocal relationship. It's a for-profit organization. We have a nonprofit as well, but it's about how do we give more opportunities to those folks who are looking for work, who have been forgotten, who do have barriers to employment. And this is one way to impact change. And again, looking at those numbers, looking at the economy that we're in right now, there's no time like the present. So that fierce urgency of now is even more true today than when that quote was referenced.
But you are also working with a most challenging population. At any given time, let's say if the unemployment numbers today is 5.3% for the total population, it's more than likely that for African Americans in particular, it's more like 14%, right? So the numbers always seem to increase substantially within the African American community for historic reasons, of course. How do we try through open hiring and other kinds of workforce programs to address and redress some of those historic issues around access, around training, and then around employment opportunities for individuals to gain a foothold back into the American mainstream? Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the unemployment numbers. There was a time pre-COVID when the unemployment rate in Yonkers was around 4%. And that was considered high at that time, but it was still close to double digits for people of color, for opportunity youth. Now we're just around 7.7% in Yonkers. But I want to think broadly now about barriers. So you've mentioned race. We can talk about gender. We can talk about the formerly incarcerated. We can talk about age. We can talk about single mothers. So let's think about barriers broadly when you think about open hiring and what that means for folks. Again, the beauty of open hiring is that it opens the doors to those folks, because we're now not looking at, just to define it, open hiring is simply putting your name on a list at our bakery. And when the next job becomes available for one of our bakery apprenticeship positions, you get it. No questions asked. We don't do background checks, no interviews or anything like that. You get the job. That eliminates a lot of the screening that takes place in what I would say is a traditional hiring environment, where we look at folks' ability to interview, where we look at folks' pedigree from an education standpoint, or just how they look and how they show up at an interview. Here, it's just simply saying, can you do this job? Are you willing to take the training that we'll offer our apprenticeships around 6 to 9 months? Do you want to be successful in this job? If the answer is yes, you're hired.
But Joseph,
show up for orientation.
if I could say this, let's go back a step. Okay, so open hiring came from somewhere.
Yeah.
You guys made an observation about the marketplace, about barriers to workforce access and opportunity. And out of that came a solution that you and your colleagues came up with, which in many ways symbolizes the genius of what you guys are doing. And it's a lesson for all of us in the Concordia community that sometimes it takes a great deal of thoughtfulness, research, analysis, introspection, feedback, before we can develop and design solutions aimed at removing significant obstacles. So at some point in time, something happened that led you guys to a place where you said, let's create this, because this will move the opportunity dial forward for many people. What was it?
Yeah, and I wish I have the privilege of leading Greyston as president and CEO now, but it was in 1982 when Bernie Glassman, our founder, saw in this area, in the Bronx section, Riverdale, Queens, Southwest Yonkers, he saw the number of folks that were unemployed, the number of folks that were excluded, and that were unwilling. People were unwilling to hire them because of whatever the reasons were. Formerly incarcerated, they were homeless, they were dealing with substance issues, whatever it might be. But there were manual jobs that were available, entry-level jobs that were available that these folks could do and were willing to do if they could just overcome their barriers. And he saw that piece, the desire, but the disconnect between those folks getting hired, he saw that as the great injustice. How can we have people ready, willing, and able to work, but we don't hire them? So he literally, at this point in time in the 80s, he and this Zen Buddhist community, they were supporting themselves, baking cakes in Riverdale. He would literally pull people off the streets and say, hey, do you want to work?
Wow.
You can learn a trade, you can learn a skill, and hopefully this will improve your trajectory in the future. That was the genesis of open hiring. It was someone saying, how do I create a thriving community? How do I give not just these folks hope that are looking for work, but they're connected to families. They live in a community that are part of society. There's a ripple effect that happens when you just employ someone. It all starts with the job. It doesn't end there, but it starts with the job. That is how open hiring was birthed. And the credit goes to Bernie Glassman and his foresight to see the need in this community that we continue to this very day, nearly 40 years later.
What has been your biggest challenge in bringing people, clients, individuals through the open hiring process? Because you have ex-offenders, right? People who are often forgotten and ignored and not trusted. Mm-hmm. You have older veterans, many of whom, 9/11 veterans who may have had issues related to their service that has made it hard for them to get back into the mainstream. Then you have older Americans who are challenged with trying to remain competitive for a variety of cultural reasons, skill-based reasons, and the like. How do you take this challenging groups of people and restore their pride, first of all, give them hope, and find a way back to them in the workforce? How do you do that?
Well, you start by looking at them as members of the organization and not as challenges. Again, the other beauty of open hiring is we're taking the costs that are usually incurred in the beginning, where you exclude people, the background checks, the time that's taken to interview, all of that, reallocating those resources, reallocating that time, reallocating those costs, and putting it into, okay, how do I make sure that my staff is successful? And it's my staff. We have this narrative that we're connected to just the reentry population or whatever, but we don't ask. So I really don't know, only anecdotally, just who's formerly incarcerated, who's a single mom, who has English as a second language, who was homeless. I don't know all the time. But what we do know is these are our employees. We provide brownie inclusions to the likes of Ben & Jerry's, Unilever, and Whole Foods. So it's a quality product from our key customers. We know we need to be successful for them. So I have to make sure that our employees are successful on the job. How do we invest in them? Whether it's training, we have a social worker who sits on site to address some of these other issues that folks are dealing with: childcare, transportation, housing, all of those other issues, because they all impact how you're being productive on the job. Sometimes your personal life does trickle into your work life. How can we mitigate that and help you be successful both personally and professionally? Because we both win when we find the solutions to that. So it's really about not so much a challenge, but how does human resources, human capital management need to evolve so that we can extend opportunities to others?
Yes. You know, as you're talking, I was thinking about some of the stories you must have gained that has inspired your work, motivated you even more, and really created a sense of optimism for the organization. Do you have any success stories among the folks that you have assisted that has made you feel good about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, and Gary, we've talked about this. The stories that I'm about to talk about are stories that can be, and there's the potential, I'm sure we'll get into this, that can be told in Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, Rochester. We have a regional hub going on there. These stories can be told elsewhere. But I will say, there's one story in particular. We just premiered a documentary that the Westchester Community College students did a documentary on us, about 20 minutes long. And they profiled 3 of our employees. And I'll highlight the one. Her name is Shauna, who's been with us for a few years now. Shauna, single mom, 5 kids, was at her wit's end of being turned down for each and every job opportunity that she went for, to the point where she was considering giving up her children. 5 children, single mom. Think about that, giving up her children. It was almost to the point where she was about to make that decision that she got the call from Greyston saying, "Are you still interested in the job?" For the night shift, by the way, which helps her in her childcare debacle. The rest is history. She's now one of our lead operators, and she has all her kids. I don't think you can put a price tag on that, but so many more stories. 20-year, formerly incarcerated person now working at Greyston, someone who has English as a second language, now working at Greyston. Successful folks in their own right. Those stories can be told time and time again. The challenge, if you want to talk about a challenge, is we have about 110 employees at Greyston, 70 of whom are open hiring. We need more companies in those cities that I just mentioned, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, to take up the mantle. And it was mentioned earlier today, large and small companies, don't be afraid of trying to do it exactly the way Greyston does. Maybe it's 1 job, maybe it's 10 jobs, maybe it is your whole division. We've worked with the Body Shop. They tried it in their distribution centers in Raleigh, North Carolina, and cut their turnover rate by 2/3. Productivity went up 13%. They were so excited about it, they introduced open hiring, they call it inclusive hiring, to their retail operations. They're now giving out 1,000 opportunities to folks. We need another body shop. If Amazon is listening, I want them to consider it. They have 800,000 positions across the US. I want other small, large, medium. We have a small company in Rochester, New York doing it.
Joseph, when you hear someone say to you,
Mhm.
okay, we have jobs, but we don't have people who have the skills to perform in those positions. What do you say to that?
Can you offer the training? What's required? Sometimes we have to take a step back and say, what is required for this job? Can they learn this job, these skills on the job? What can you provide up front that will get them ready? Or you can work with Greyston. We have a nonprofit that provides workforce development training to the folks here in Southwest Yonkers. Are there trainings that a nonprofit can provide to get them ready so that they can get to the point where they can apply for Gary Officer's position that he has open? Let's think creatively about it. Because at the end of the day, in the US Chamber of Commerce across the country is saying, 90% of them are saying, economic opportunity is being inhibited because we can't find people. So let's figure out a way to get the people into the organization and think differently about how we look at human capital management.
Do you feel, this is me talking here, do you feel that the sheer balkanization of the US workforce system, development system, is partly at fault for not creating and providing the tools, the skills, the coordination of activities between agencies to help address some of these issues? Because coming out of the housing world and other networks I've been involved in, you always felt you were part of something larger than yourself. In the workforce space, there are so many subsystems funded through different discrete funding programs, and very few of us are talking to each other. Are we somehow to be held responsible for the challenges of getting people into these jobs?
Yeah, so I don't want to beat up the workforce development community, but I do want to help them up. I just authored an opinion piece that just came out, and it talks about the outages that we have, and you're talking about it right now. There are some outages in terms of how we're looking at funding workforce development. And I mentioned like nonprofits like Greyston that are in the community, that are training people, that are placing people in jobs 20% above the New York State minimum wage. We have to invest in those to get folks ready. We have to talk to folks like a Greyston, and I'm being very biased right now, but we have to look at more innovative ways of looking at inclusive employment, inclusive hiring, and figure out how do we get these folks on the sideline? Because let's be honest, there is a disconnect. If I've got 9.2, 9.3 job openings, 9.5 people looking for work, another 10 million that have dropped out of the labor force, clearly something is not working. So we have to think about things differently. So let's figure out a way as a community, working with nonprofits, businesses, and the government, a collaborative here, and figuring out how do we address this whole idea of human capital management.
That's true, but one can argue that, and you're right. I think in this country, the workforce system has been funded almost exclusively by government, right? The Department of Labor. Private philanthropy, a $700 billion industry, invests less than 2% of its grants in workforce development. Less than 2%. Companies, private companies may offer sponsorships and small program funding, dinners for galas, fundraisers, but in terms of real investment in the system to help people like yourself, move folks who have the motivation and desire into the mainstream, those resources are scarce. How does it manifest itself? When we had our big economic shock last year, our unemployment numbers went from 3.6% to 22% in 5 months. In Germany, it went from 3.6% to 5%. Singapore, it didn't move at all. Because you had a system where government, corporations, the private sector were all and civil society were all invested in the workforce system to the extent that they believe collectively that it was in the national interest to have a resilient workforce. So what is your take on the relationship between government, private corporations, and philanthropy in helping to bring resources into a space that is fundamentally important to our nation's long-term economic future? What's your take on that?
I'll tell you our take and our experience. I mean, we've been proud to have the support of folks like Generation IM in London, the Rochester Community Foundation, our federal government, our state government, our local government here in Yonkers, but we've also been working with the business community as well. It has to happen because we all don't have the one solution, but we all have a part in it.
Right.
In this algebra equation that we have. I can do the training, government can do the funding, the businesses can provide the opportunities. That's how it works. But we also have to be intentional about it. What's the problem that we're really trying to solve? We mentioned some of these cohorts within the folks with barriers, single moms, dealing with childcare issue, formerly incarcerated, dealing with their records. There has to be a way for us, as government needs to think about how can we remove those barriers. Businesses have to change their approach to human capital management, and nonprofit communities do need to be invested in by private dollars, private philanthropy. Again, we've been blessed to have all involved in the solutions here in Southwest Yonkers, but there needs to be more of that. And that's why we want to see what we're doing at Greyston. We're having regional hubs launched in Rochester, New York City, in our own backyard in Westchester County. So we can create this ecosystem of inclusive hiring within our own context, because like I said, whether it's Detroit, whether it's Chicago, whether it's New York City, whether it's Philadelphia, whether it's London, they're all dealing with pretty much the same thing. Same problems, same challenges.
Let me twist this a little bit, if I may indulge. Now we're dealing with jobs as it relates to the challenges of finding opportunities for people who've left the workforce or have had episodic engagement. But there's a bigger trend occurring, which I'd like to point you to. According to the Joint Center for Economic and Political Studies, 2/3 of positions that Hispanics and African Americans currently perform have a very high likelihood of disappearing within the next 10 years. I have 4 or 5 Bank of America branches within a 5-mile radius of my house. There's no staff in there. I go to a supermarket anywhere close to my house. I see more machines when I see cashiers, right? The number 1 occupation in 45 states is truck drivers, when Tesla and Ford are testing driverless vehicles. So we're going to begin to see the emergence of a workforce in 10 years that will look substantially different than it does now. And in fact, COVID-19, some would argue, has accelerated us into the future. And the communities that will suffer the most will be Black and brown communities, because most of the jobs that will be affected are jobs that Black and brown communities are currently employed in. What's your thoughts on that? The future of work and how we prepare people for a workforce that will look very different tomorrow than it was a year ago.
Yeah, we just had a town hall at Greyston. I was saying to the staff, when I was growing up, and probably you too, Gary, we looked at jobs as functions. You want to be a lawyer, you want to be a doctor, you want to be a banker. And I said, nowadays, we've now got to be learners. We've got to be analytical. We've got to constantly be thinking about how can we improve ourselves and make sure that we're aligned with the larger trajectory of where work is going. With inclusive employment, it is looking at just that, not just the job. The job is just the first part of it, but we do have to be intentional about how do we move people along in terms of their career pathways. So it's training. How do I get to the next level? How do I get from entry level to middle management to senior to C-suite, boardroom? That's a level of intentionality, but that's also an intent to look at metrics,
Yes.
numbers. How do we know that we're being successful as we look at how the economy, how human resources and employment is evolving over time? And are we going to be ready as this next evolution occurs? Which is why even at Greyston, we were moving from entry level, still focused on that in terms of our training. But now we're looking at those middle skill jobs, those jobs where you need more than a high school diploma, but less than a college degree. What are those nationally recognized certifications that someone can earn in emerging industries, IT, healthcare, construction, all of those different areas that they still need people, but they don't have the qualified people. So how do we prepare our folks for those jobs in the future? But again, continuing to innovate and continuing to do better as the economy changes, as these positions change. We have to be ready for that, but we can't do that resting on our laurels.
That's right. I have a question for you from our audience. I'm looking at 2 screens here. So let me question number 1. How does human resources and human capital management need to evolve so that we can extend opportunities to others?
It's called having a mind shift in your thinking. I mean, you know this, Gary, I come from corporate America. I worked for Wall Street firms. If you had told me open hiring was the best thing since sliced bread, I probably would have laughed at you, because it is just crazy to think that you don't do interviews or background checks. But it's really a mind shift, seeing how it works, just looking at how it works. Go to the body shop and just see how it works, and understand for yourself, like, all these requirements, all these processes, is it really paying off? Is it working?
Mhm.
If it's not working, why do we continue to do it? But if you see a company like a Greyston, a Giant Eagle in Pittsburgh, a body shop, Clean Craft in Rochester, if you see these types of companies doing something else that is working, but also bringing in folks that were traditionally excluded, how would that work within my own organization? What within our own culture needs to change? And again, it might just be one job out of your 100 or whatever it might be. It might just be one department, but have an expansive view, whether it's maintenance, whether it's your manufacturing facility, whether it's your clerical positions, food service, I could go on, home healthcare, all of these different positions that are out there that just require somebody willing to learn and show up.
Yes.
That's called the mind shift that needs to happen in this country, in human resources, human capital. I would just say the organization as a whole, because it is a cultural issue within the organization. Because as you bring on folks, you need to have the buy-in, not just from the C-suite, but also your middle managers and all the folks below and between.
That's right. As you're talking, I'm thinking also back to my earlier statement about the George Floyd incident and how it has created a movement around a time where we are now talking about inclusion. We're talking about equity. We're talking about workforce opportunity. And many corporations have signed proclamations and diversified their boards and hired chief diversity officers, all as a response to what these amazing young people in this country unleashed last year, which was a movement about change and a real desire for this country to realize its full promise to every citizen. So we're at this incredible moment when the attention of leaders is now on equity inclusion. What are your thoughts from the perspective, not of small businesses, which you have spoken to quite eloquently, and how these small businesses and local communities really are an important part of the solution, but these larger companies, right? They have made these proclamations, signed big checks, and we don't want that momentum to go away, nor do we want their commitment to be one driven simply by writing a big check and saying goodbye to the issue until the next go around. What do you say to large corporations, the Comcast, the Amazon, and others that employ tens of thousands of people across this country? Right? are in so many communities and who are looking for people. And we have those people in our networks who need jobs. What do you say to them?
You know, in the United States, we have one of our states is Missouri, and their theme is "Show me," and that is what I would say to them. I'm all for. There's nothing wrong with the money that goes to the nonprofits that they all wrote checks for, as you mentioned, the black squares on your social media screen, the hiring of the chief diversity officers. Those are all great, and I hope that they're effective. But how do we know that?
That's right.
And I need you to show me that. What are the metrics that we are going to be looking for the next 5 to 10 years? How many people have you hired? How have you diversified your entry-level workforce? What does your middle managers look like? How does that look from the people of color that are brought into the people of color that make it to the top?
That's right.
Or make it to your boards? I need those metrics to really be convinced that we're being effective, because otherwise it's fanfare, it's publicity, it's good marketing, it's good CSR, but it's not effective.
That's right.
And the one thing that I can say about Greyston is we've been effective at bringing people in. We've hired folks. We're paying folks 15, 16% above the livable wage in New York State. We're bringing in 95% of our folks are people of color, 70 of whom are African American, 30 are Hispanic. We have a very diverse board. I need you to show me how your language, the rhetoric, is matching up to the effectiveness aligned with metrics of success.
That's right.
Because if without the metrics of success, it's just, I don't think George Floyd or COVID caused anything. They've always been there. It's just been elevated because it seems to keep happening. I could go back to Rodney King in the early 90s. This is not new. Or you mentioned MLK in the beginning. They were talking about police brutality then. So these aren't new issues.
That's right.
So the issues have been around for a long time, but it's at a point where there's a forgotten class. If 2016 didn't teach us anything, there is an undercurrent of folks who just feel like they have been left out of what is an amazing economy. And I will never disparage capitalism, but there is something wrong with the practitioners when we continue to keep asking these questions about opportunity, about inclusivity when it comes to hiring and employment, about the folks in our cities that are just seem like they're missing the boat while others are doing very well for themselves. There's got to be some metrics of success tied to this. And no one is better at measuring success. And I heard Melody Hobson of Ariel Capital Management talk about this the other day. We're very good at measuring profit and revenue and market share. But when it comes to the issues of inclusion, we're kind of fuzzy with how we know we're being successful. We know how to do it in corporate America. It's just a matter of intentionality.
But we also need people like you, Joseph, people who have the smarts, who are connected to the community, who have great proximity to those who need you the most, who can engage various stakeholders in the community to try and create pathways. We need people like you to help give hope to so many who are dependent on people like us. My final question for you today, before I end up my own thoughts, is there is a lot of talk about a staffing crisis and businesses having difficulty filling positions all during historic levels of unemployment. What would you say to business owners who are having trouble finding workers?
Yeah, this is what we've been talking about. I don't think there is a shortage. I think it's how we've been looking at hiring, where we have been looking at hiring. Again, we talked about the partnerships. Are we talking to our local governments, our Department of Social Services? I'm a former deputy commissioner of our county social services. Are we talking to the folks that are on public assistance that are looking for work within our own governments? Are we talking to the local nonprofits that may be working with single moms that would love to work for a particular company? Are we dealing with the formerly incarcerated, and many of whom actually come with credentials? The older citizens who are looking for work. Is there a clerical position that could be right for them? There are so many ways we can look at this, but we just have to be expanded in our views in terms of where we're looking and how we're hiring.
Yes.
And we will see that maybe our own practices have been keeping us from
Yes.
finding that talent that we all say we want, because they're paying referral bonuses, we're paying sign-on bonuses, wages are going through the roof. I have people paying $20, $27 an hour looking for people. They can't find people.
Right.
We're able to find them at Greyston because of who we work with.
You know, one of the things I've said on many occasions on multiple platforms, which is kind of counterintuitive given where I started the conversation today, that one of the geniuses of this country, really, one of the geniuses of this country is that in the local communities around this place, we have people who are essentially decent people. There's good people out there. We also have a spirit of volunteerism that is astounding. And we also have what's called, what I refer to as the genius of philanthropy, when engaged, can help mobilize great outcomes. So I'm hopeful because people like you are able to bring all those pieces together to help people who are marginalized and displaced and abandoned find hope through your persistence and your leadership. So my question for you as we conclude today is, Joseph Kenner, what gives you hope? What gives you hope?
The very fact that we're even having this conversation, the very fact that there is a body shop, a Giant Eagle, a Clean Craft, practicing inclusive hiring in some form, and many others are interested, gives me hope. When I first became CEO, within the first few months, I issued a newsletter. We're looking at the word crisis in Chinese. It's two characters. One means opportunity, the other means danger. And throughout all of this, there is opportunity. The crises that we've had, yes, we could be fearful of them.
Yes.
But they've elevated something in this country. The lack of trust, the lack of opportunity, the lack of access, all of those things are occurring because we need to think differently.
Yes.
And people are starting to think differently. And I am going to continue to be persistent. I'm going to continue to talk to the US chambers, the business roundtables. I am issuing my call again to Amazon. Let's try this thing and see if it works. We know it works. We've been doing it for 40 years and others have been doing it to great success. But something has to be done, right, Gary? I mean, 9.3 unfilled jobs, 9.5 looking for work, almost 10 million dropping out of the labor force. That is a travesty.
That's right.
But I have hope because this place called Greyston, my mantra is buy, donate, replicate. Buy our brownies, go to greyston.org, donate to our nonprofit so that we can continue to train folks and then see this model replicated in some form so that we can give more opportunities to the folks that need it. And when we do that, Gary, I did mention this, we project it's about $3 billion of impact for just 1% of that 10 million.
Wow.
Looking for work.
Wow.
Let's get that money off the table and let's create some economic opportunity here.
Well, you inspire me, and I'm sure you've inspired many today. And I know that your work will continue to impact a lot of people. And I hope there's somebody out there in today's audience that will call you after this conversation and want to find out more about what you do and how they can help you.
Please go to greyston.org. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
You bet. Thank you so much.